When talking about Europe, people usually gravitate towards the main powers such as France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. With that being said, many smaller countries that have rich histories and unique traits take the back seat to some of these top dogs. One of these countries is Switzerland. When people hear about Switzerland, they usually think of skiing and clocks, but today we'll be exploring Switzerland's lesser-known intricacies. In this video, we will be looking at their neutral history, unique direct democracy, and other things that I find remarkable about this European gem. This is everything you need to know about Switzerland. Let's start with the basics. Switzerland is a country in Central Europe bordered by Germany to the north, Austria to the east, Italy to the south, and France and Liechtenstein to the west. The country has no official capital, but the de facto capital is Bern. Switzerland is separated into 20 cantons and 6 half-cantons, which are basically Swiss provinces. Each canton has its own parliament and constitution, which makes each canton basically its own mini-state inside of Switzerland. The country is situated right smack in the middle of the Alps mountain range. For this region, about 60% of Switzerland's area is comprised of mountainous regions. Due to the difficult living conditions in mountains, the majority of the Swiss population lives in the northern region of Switzerland called the Swiss Plateau. This area is comprised of plains and hills which offer a more livable condition for the masses. This is an observable phenomenon when looking at a map of Switzerland. As you can clearly see, the three main cities of Zurich, Geneva, and Bern are all located north of the Alps, with very few cities being in the southern portion of the country. Anyways, because of Switzerland being a relatively small European country and only 30% of that land being practical to live in, the country only has a meager 8.1 million people. Now, although that may seem like a fairly small number for a country, Switzerland's small population does allow the country to lead in many different fields. For instance, they have the second highest nominal GDP per capita at $84,000, which is crazy when you consider that the first country in the list is Luxembourg, that only has 500,000 people, compared to Switzerland's 8.1 million. To return to demographics, Switzerland has 4 official languages: German, French, Italian, and Romance, although more than 80% of the population speaks German or French. Many of you might have never heard of Romance, and I certainly didn't either before doing research for this video. Romance is a local dialect primarily spoken in the southeastern canton of Graubünden. Now, although only 0.5% of the Swiss population speaks Romance, it is still constitutionally obliged to be a national language, although many cantons opt out to include their legislator in Romance language. Anyways, with that all being said, Switzerland prides itself on its diversity, with the more French culture in the east, German culture in the north, Italian culture to the south, and isolated Romance culture in the Graubünden canton. Religion is also very prevalent in Switzerland, with 38% of Swiss people identifying as Roman Catholic and 27% identifying as Reformed. Only 21% of the Swiss populace identifies as agnostic or atheist, but 56% of Swiss people don't believe that religion is important. Now that we have covered demographics, let's look at Switzerland's history, which will hopefully answer the question as to why they are one of the only truly neutral countries in the world. I will skip all the really old stuff because I don't feel like it is really pertinent to what this video is about. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is supposed to be everything you need to know about Switzerland, so don't I need to know this stuff? My answer to that is, I don't really think so. The Switzerland we know today is not really the same Switzerland that was around 2,000 years ago. I think we can skip over all the Roman and Dark Ages stuff to just go straight to the Middle Ages, when Switzerland truly became a state as we know it today. So the story of independent Switzerland starts in the year of 1291 between 3 small autonomous states which were all in the modern area of Switzerland. I say the beginning of independent Switzerland because before that they were under Roman rule, and then Frankish rule, and finally under Holy Roman rule, so they weren't truly autonomous. The 3 original duchies were Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, which are to this day still 3 cantons in Switzerland. These 3 states signed the Federal Charter of 1291, which solidified peace between them. This is considered to be Switzerland's founding document, even though it was not officially creating the state of Switzerland, and there were surely treaties and agreements signed before between these 3 districts. Anyways, after about 60 years of peace and prosperity, the original 3 decided to include 5 more neighbors into their ménage à trois to create the Old Confederacy, which would last until the 1500s. Even though the Confederacy only lasted until the 1500s, the cantons each had sovereignty until the French Revolution. Now, just to illustrate what the Swiss Confederacy looked like at the time, let's look at a couple of maps. The first is the local map of Switzerland at the time, which really does not show what it looked like on the bigger scale, but we can clearly see the cantons which are still present to this day and generally occupy the same area. The second map is from your atlas, and I found this map a lot more interesting because it shows what the world looked like in 1500 and where Switzerland was at the time, in the red outline. Looking at this outline and comparing it to what Switzerland looks like now, we can see that Switzerland hasn't changed much in the past 500 years. Now, at this time, the Swiss were not completely neutral yet, and the mercenaries of the Confederacy were seen as nearly invisible since the country had grown so rapidly through wars. Anyways, between this time and the French Revolution, there were many revolts, wars, treaties, and most importantly, a Reformation movement of the Catholic religion that actually started in Switzerland. Now, these things are all interesting, but not really pertinent to the video. If we want to get to the really important stuff, we need to get to 1798, where France, who had recently become a republic and was feeling very mighty, decided to invade Switzerland. Switzerland sadly stood no chance against their powerful French neighbor. After winning the war, France left Switzerland as a vassal, but centralized their government by abolishing the cantonal system they had been using for nearly 4 centuries. France also took a few Swiss cities, such as Mulhausen, for their own, which they still own to this day. Now, although Switzerland was a vassal to France, they were not very loyal subjects. I mean, would you really be after being invaded and getting your traditional governmental type crushed by the French? I certainly know I wouldn't. So when in 1803 the Napoleonic coalition struck against France for their warmongering behavior, Switzerland refused to fight alongside them, even though they were a vassal and were pretty much obliged to. Instead of acting violently, though, Napoleon and his government had many negotiations with the Swiss government, which finally ended with the Act of Mediation, which gave Switzerland a lot of its autonomy and reinstituted 19 of the Swiss cantons. France was so adamant with negotiating with what might seem like an irrelevant force comparatively to the massive French army, because Switzerland had gained, as I previously stated, a reputation of invincibility, and Napoleon didn't really want to fight that. So Napoleon decided it was important to have Swiss mercenaries and soldiers amongst his ranks, and he did end up with just that. Luckily for the Swiss, though, 12 years later in 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, Switzerland was deemed fully independent and, most importantly, neutral. However, until 1860, Swiss troops fought for other governments, but technically Switzerland has been neutral since 1815, which is very impressive. Now, neutrality seems honorable at first, but there is something that must be kept in mind. Switzerland stayed truly neutral, even in times where it was morally wrong to do so. Switzerland was never invaded during both world wars, and there is a reason as to why they were not. Switzerland was an important messenger between both the Axis and Allied powers, and it was a safe haven for many refugees coming from both sides. During the Second World War, Switzerland accepted over 300,000 refugees, and the International Red Cross was created in Geneva, which is still an organization that exists today. Now, I said that not all neutrality is honorable, and I will explain why. Being neutral is not strictly political. It can also mean to be economically neutral. The Swiss had many economic deals with Nazi Germany during World War II that aided the Axis power. After the war, there was much controversy over these trade deals and the moral ambiguity of Switzerland. To this day, people label Switzerland as Nazi sympathizers, which is not entirely the case, but I can see their argument. Anyhow, I think that wraps up history for Switzerland. Remember, there are a lot of finer details that I did not mention in the synopsis, especially the Reformation, that I would highly suggest you read up on this because Switzerland has a very rich and deep history, but alas, we must move on. So now that we are on the same page about past Switzerland, we can now look at modern day Switzerland. So let's start with their unique governmental system, which I briefly mentioned before. Now, as a quick side note, if you did not see my previous video on government, there's an annotation on screen if you do want to check it out. It might be useful to check it out since it goes into detail on how governments work around the world. If you do not watch this video, however, you'll still be able to enjoy this video, don't worry. So, what is it that makes Switzerland's governing method so unique? Well, like any other republic, Switzerland has an elected, legislative, and an executive power, separated in 2 different buildings. They resemble a parliamentary system, but have some differences such as their head of state being a group of individuals, which is called the Swiss Federal Council, which reserves a seat to at least one representative of each major party. And I mean, look at how civil and respectful they seem to be to each other in these pictures. If only other countries could be so courteous to people of opposing beliefs. I think it's just really great. Anyways, to get back to it, together these 2 powers make and execute new laws in Switzerland. Now, this is where things get really crazy. Switzerland is the only direct democracy left in the world. Now, before we get into what that means, let's distinguish direct democracies from representative democracies. A direct democracy is the most basic and transparent form of democracy where the population has a direct say on which laws are passed and which laws are rejected. Direct democracies are very ineffective in modern day societies because of the huge amount of voters and territory constraints. In ancient Athens, for instance, it made sense that people would directly vote on certain laws because of their small voter base and relatively centralized city. But if we look at Canada, for example, direct democracy would be impossible because look at the size of the country. It already takes 5 hours to go from Ottawa to Toronto, let alone Ottawa to Vancouver. So, in a representative democracy, however, which is every democracy except for Switzerland, the populace elects representatives to choose the laws and execute the laws. Instead of the population having to move every time a law is being modified or created, only the elected officials have to travel. So now you're probably thinking about how Switzerland can fit all 6 million of their eligible voters into their parliament. Well, don't worry. The way they do direct democracy is really quite genius. They do it through referendums. Let me elaborate. So let's say a law is passed in the Swiss parliament that bans all pizza from Switzerland. In the case of this horrible law, or any law for that matter, any Swiss citizen that can gather 50,000 signatures of people who are against this new law within 100 days of its creation makes that the government of Switzerland will call a nationwide referendum for or against that law. And that way, it lets the people decide which laws pass and which do not. But it is very efficient because only if 50,000 citizens are initially unhappy about a law can they do a referendum. Thus, only the controversial laws are ever called for a referendum. Alternatively, there is a way that citizens can propose new laws with a similar system. If 100,000 people sign a petition in favor of a new law, the government has to call a nationwide referendum for the new law. When I learned that a system like this still existed, I was really impressed, and I personally think that this system should be tested out in other countries. But hey, that's just me. So we looked at their unique history, we looked at their unique government form, and now let's look at their unique world status. Switzerland is seen around the world as a sort of neutral utopia. Now with the neutrality, Switzerland opens their borders to anyone who can pay. For example, Kim Jong-un, North Korea's dictator, went to school in Switzerland. This kind of moral gray area is also seen with their bank secrecy, which allows rich entrepreneurs from around the world to hide huge sums of money in secret Swiss bank accounts. In these accounts, the money is taxed very little, and it is a way for huge companies to commit tax fraud with little risk of getting caught. But it's certainly not all bad for Switzerland. They have a very charitable nature with the creation of the Red Cross, which is one of the largest humanitarian organizations in the world. Also, Switzerland is so beautiful. Come on, look at these pictures. It's such a gorgeous country. With these gorgeous vistas, Switzerland attracts millions of tourists each year. Now, another aspect of their neutrality is their absence from major world organizations. Switzerland only joined the UN in 2002, which is crazy considering North Korea joined in 1981, 11 years earlier. Although they are a part of the UN, that is pretty much the only organization they are a part of. They did not join the EU, even though they are situated directly in the middle of Europe and leave a huge gaping hole in the middle of the EU map. Anyway, since they are not a part of the EU, they have their own currency, known as the Swiss franc, and they are kind of lucky for not going with the euro since it's not been going so well anyways. Anyhow, even though they are not a part of the EU, they are a part of the Schengen area, which is basically all the countries in Europe that have open borders to each other. So, if I wanted to go for my huge road trip from Lisbon to Vienna, I would not have to take a long detour around Switzerland, since they are a part of the Schengen area. Well, I think that is all I have to say about Switzerland. They are a unique gem nestled into a beautiful area of Europe. They are leaders in human development, philanthropy, and liberty, and should be looked up to as a model country. Overall, as you can probably tell, I am a huge fan of Switzerland and would love to visit the country one day. Although it's way too expensive, seriously expensive. Oh, and if I miss anything that you find important about Switzerland, please leave it in the comments so that everyone can learn a bit more about this awesome country, including myself. Well, that wraps me up for today. Make sure to subscribe to see my next video about semi-autonomous regions around the world, where I'll be looking at interesting regions that have some autonomy inside their mother state. Oh, and also make sure to check out my Facebook and Twitter page for constant updates and news stories that I find interesting. And if you want to go a step above and beyond, you can check out my Patreon page where I offer perks for a bit of extra cash. Anyways, thanks for watching, and this has been everything you need to know about Switzerland.